200 billion marks. That is the price of a single loaf of bread. Let that number sink into your skull for a moment. Not a luxury car, not a mansion on the Riviera, but a lump of flour, water, and yeast that you eat just to survive another day. Welcome to Berlin, November 1923, the absolute ground zero of financial insanity, where the laws of economics didn't just break, they were taken out back and shot by a firing squad of printing presses. You think you know what inflation feels like because your morning latte costs 50 cents more than it did last year. Oh, you sweet summer child. You have no idea. You are complaining about a paper cut while looking at a patient who has been decapitated. Imagine this scene because it actually happened. A woman fills a wheelbarrow, a literal construction tool meant for hauling bricks, with bundles of cash. She leaves it outside a bakery for 30 seconds to check if they have any bread left. When she turns around, the wheelbarrow is gone. The thief stole the rusty wheelbarrow and dumped the pile of money on the sidewalk because the wheelbarrow was the only thing that held any real value. That is the world we are diving into today. A world where children built kite tails out of banknotes because it was cheaper than buying toys. A world where men used currency as wallpaper because it cost less than actual wallpaper. It is a grotesque carnival of despair, a place where money died. But why should you care about a century-old nightmare? Because the ghost of the Weimar Republic isn't haunting a history book. It is sitting in the boardroom of every major central bank right now. We are looking at the Weimar hyperinflation not as a dusty anecdote, but as the ultimate autopsy of what happens when a government believes it can cheat reality. It is the story of how a sophisticated, educated, and industrialized nation decided that the solution to being broke was to print fantasy money until the ink ran dry. It starts with a trickle of bad decisions wrapped in patriotic lies and ends with a tsunami that wipes out the middle class, leaving behind nothing but rage and ash. You are standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into the abyss of 1923, and if you listen closely to the wind howling up from that dark pit, it sounds suspiciously like the economic news playing on your television tonight. We are going to dissect this corpse to find the disease that killed it, because that same disease is currently circulating in the global bloodstream. So, grab your wheelbarrow, because we are about to go shopping in hell. The road to hell is not paved with good intentions. It is paved with freshly printed banknotes, and in 1914 Germany started laying the asphalt with enthusiastic efficiency. To understand how a nation commits financial suicide, you have to look at the geniuses in charge. Before the first shot of World War I was even fired, the German government made a decision that would eventually doom them more effectively than any mustard gas or trench warfare. They suspended the gold standard. They looked at the constraints of reality, the idea that money should actually represent something tangible, and said, "No thanks, we prefer magic." They decided to finance the entire war, not by taxing their citizens, because that makes people angry, but by borrowing huge sums and printing the difference. It was the ultimate kick the can down the road strategy, except the can was filled with nitroglycerin. Then came the peace, if you can call it that. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a surrender, it was a foreclosure notice. The Allies slapped Germany with a reparations bill of 132 billion gold marks. To put that in perspective, that was a number so large it was essentially imaginary. Germany was stripped of its industrial territories, its colonies, and its dignity, yet told to pay a mortgage on a house that had already burned down. A rational government might have defaulted. A rational government might have negotiated. But the Weimar government chose the path of the coward and the con artist. They turned on the printing presses to full speed. It was a feast of madmen. The logic was terrifyingly simple and stupid. We don't have money to pay the workers. Print it. We don't have money to pay the French. Print it. We don't have money to buy paper to print money on. Print more money to buy the paper. It was the economic equivalent of trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it because the gasoline is liquid and looks somewhat like water. They deluded themselves into thinking they were solving a liquidity crisis, when in reality, they were dissolving the very foundation of trust that society stands on. The tragedy is that, at first, it felt like a party. This is the seduction of the printing press. When the government floods the system with new money, it feels like a stimulant shot into the veins of a dying patient. The government paid its bills, the factories kept running, and the bureaucrats patted themselves on the back for their monetary flexibility. They sneered at the rigid economic laws of the past. They thought they had discovered a perpetual motion machine for finance, but they hadn't discovered anything new. They had simply legalized counterfeiting and made the state the criminal ringleader. They were trading their future for a few months of quiet, unaware that they were winding a spring so tight that when it finally snapped, it would take the heads off everyone in the room. You look at this and laugh at their stupidity, don't you? You think, how could they be so blind? But pause for a second. Look at the deficits of your own government today. Look at the stimulus packages funded by thin air. The terminology has changed. We use polite words like quantitative easing now instead of printing press madness. But the mechanism is identical. Weimar Germany didn't start with a wheelbarrow of cash. It started with a temporary measure to handle an emergency. It started with the arrogant belief that a few men in a room could outsmart the laws of supply and demand. They were wrong then. And the only question remaining is, how long until we realize we are sitting at the same table, eating the same poisoned feast? Here is the sickest joke of the financial world, the punchline that nobody sees coming until it smacks them in the face. Before hyperinflation kills you, it gets you high. It intoxicates you. It whispers in your ear that you are a genius, that the economy is booming, and that the good times will never end. This is the illusion of prosperity, a hallucinogenic phase where the poison tastes exactly like fine wine. In the early 1920s, before the wheelbarrows and the starvation, Germany looked, to the untrained eye, like an economic miracle. The factories were roaring, smoke was pouring from the stacks, and unemployment practically vanished. Why? Because the German mark was collapsing in value against foreign currencies. Suddenly, German goods were dirt cheap for the rest of the world. Foreigners flocked to Berlin like vultures to a carcass, buying up porcelain, machinery, and real estate for pennies on the dollar. The export sector was on fire. Orders were piling up. If you owned a factory, you felt like a king. You were printing profits just as fast as the government was printing marks. But the real comedy was happening in the stock market. Oh, the stock market, that great casino of human delusion. As the currency lost its value, people frantically dumped their cash into stocks, hoping to hold on to something, anything that wasn't paper. This sent stock prices rocketing to the moon. A man who bought shares in a steel company on Tuesday was a millionaire by Friday. Imagine the ego on these people. They sat in cafes, smoking cigars, bragging about their portfolio returns, completely oblivious to the fact that they were millionaires in a currency that was rapidly becoming toilet paper. It is the money illusion in its purest, deadliest form. You feel rich because the number in your bank account has more zeros, but you don't notice that the price of a ham sandwich has just surpassed your weekly earnings. It was a catastrophe boom, a term that should terrify every investor today. It is the economic equivalent of a body consuming its own muscle to stay alive. The activity wasn't real growth. It was a frantic flight from cash. People were buying pianos they couldn't play and rugs they didn't need, just to get rid of the money burning a hole in their pockets. It was a manic game of musical chairs, where everyone was dancing, laughing, and drinking, refusing to acknowledge that the music had technically stopped hours ago. They were cannibalizing the nation's capital, selling off the country's assets for worthless paper, and calling it business. Does this sound familiar? It should. Look at your own world. Look at the asset bubbles inflating around you, while the real economy struggles to breathe. Look at the people celebrating because their house is worth twice what they paid for it, while they struggle to fill the gas tank. It is the same intoxicating lie. You aren't getting richer. Your money is dying, and the rising prices of assets are just the tombstone on its grave. The Germans in 1922 thought they were riding a wave of endless liquidity. They didn't realize they were actually circling the drain. The euphoria of this phase is the most dangerous part of the trap because it keeps you complacent. It keeps you holding on to the paper. It keeps you believing the lie just long enough for the trap to snap shut. And when the high wears off, the hangover isn't a headache. It's total, absolute ruin. Then comes the moment the ice cracks. It is the tipping point, the terrifying instant where the collective psychology of a nation snaps, and the velocity of money goes from a jog to a sprint, and finally, to warp speed. In economics, we talk about the velocity of money politely, as if it's just a variable in an equation. In Weimar Germany, it wasn't a variable. It was a panic attack. It was the moment everyone realized that the paper in their pocket was like a block of ice melting in the Sahara sun. Every second you held it, it got smaller. So, what do? You get rid of it. You get rid of it fast. You don't buy what you need. You buy anything that isn't money. This is where the stories go from tragic to absolutely surreal. Imagine walking into a bar. You order a beer for 4,000 marks. That's steep, but you have the cash. You drink it, maybe chat with a friend for 30 minutes. You signal for the check. The waiter comes over and says, "That will be 8,000 marks. You argue, you scream, but he just points to the chalkboard. The price went up while the foam was settling in your glass. That is not inflation. That is financial velocity moving faster than you can swallow. The currency was dying in real time, decomposing right in front of your eyes. Life became a frantic, sweaty race against the clock. Workers began to demand to be paid not once a week, but every day. Then twice a day. Imagine the scene at the factory gates. Wives, mothers, and children standing there, waiting like relay runners. The whistle blows at noon. The husband sprints out, hands over a bundle of cash, still warm from the printing press, and the wife takes off running. She isn't running for exercise. She is running because by 1 p.m., that bundle of cash might buy a loaf of bread, but by 3 p.m., it might only buy a single roll. If she trips and falls, the delay costs the family their dinner. It was a daily marathon of survival, fueled by the terrifying knowledge that money had an expiration date measured in minutes. The printing presses couldn't even keep up with the physical demand for paper. They started printing money on one side only to save ink. They took old bills, 1,000 mark notes, and stamped 1 billion in red ink across the face. It was lazy, it was pathetic, and it was the ultimate admission of defeat. The number printed on the bill became irrelevant. The paper itself was the only constant. Postage stamps cost more than the letters they were stuck to. People started using banknotes as kindling to light their stoves because it burned longer and was cheaper than buying actual firewood. Think about the absurdity of that image. Burning wealth to keep warm because the wealth is worthless. At this stage, the social contract didn't just break, it evaporated. Trust, the invisible glue that holds civilization together, was gone. Shopkeepers hated their customers. Customers hated the shopkeepers. If you had goods, shoes, coal, potatoes, you were a god. If you had money, you were a beggar holding confetti. The connection between work and reward was severed. Why work for a wage that vanishes before you can spend it? The economy ceased to be a system of exchange and became a looting spree where everyone was trying to rob everyone else before the clock struck midnight. This wasn't just an economic crisis anymore. It was the prelude to total moral collapse. This is the part of the story where the laughter stops and the bleeding really starts. If you want to destroy a civilization, You don't need nuclear weapons. You just need to destroy the middle class. And hyperinflation is a precision-guided missile aimed directly at the heart of the people who played by the rules. It is the brutal murder of the prudent, the saver, and the responsible citizen. Think about the old fable of the ant and the grasshopper. The ant works hard, saves for winter, and survives. The grasshopper plays, saves nothing, and starves. In Weimar Germany, the government flipped this moral universe upside down. The ant didn't just starve. The ant was robbed blind, beaten, and left in the gutter, while the grasshopper bought the ant's house for the price of a postage stamp and threw a champagne party on the lawn. Imagine a German couple who had worked for 40 years. They were the backbone of the nation. They scrimped, they saved, they denied themselves luxuries to build a nest egg of 50,000 marks. In 1918, that money was a fortune, a comfortable retirement, a legacy for their children. By late 1923, that life savings, representing 4 decades of sweat and sacrifice, couldn't even buy a subway ticket to get to the bank to withdraw it. Their past was erased. Their future was incinerated. They were left destitute, forced to sell their family heirlooms, their wedding rings, and eventually their dignity, just to eat. Meanwhile, who were the winners? The sharks, the speculators, the debtors. This was the golden age for the borrower. Imagine you borrowed 5 million marks in 1920 to buy a factory or a block of apartments. By 1923, you could pay off that entire debt by selling a single chicken. You ended up owning the real asset, the factory, the land, the machinery, completely free and clear, while the bank that lent you the money was left holding a worthless piece of paper. It was the greatest transfer of wealth in history, shifting power from the virtuous middle class to the reckless gamblers and the industrial tycoons who understood the game. This destruction did something worse than make people poor. It made them cynical. It killed the soul of the nation. Why work hard? Why be honest? Why save? The system had just taught everyone a brutal lesson. Honesty is for suckers. If you work hard, you lose. If you gamble and cheat, you win. The moral fabric of society unraveled completely. Crime exploded. Prostitution became a survival strategy for respectable families, and a deep, festering resentment took root. The middle class didn't just lose their money. They lost their faith in democracy and the state. And when you strip a proud people of their dignity and their savings, you create a vacuum of rage that is just waiting for a charismatic madman to fill. You look at that anger and you think it's history. Look at the savers in your own country, earning 0% interest, while inflation eats 5% of their purchasing power every year. The mechanism is slower, but the theft is exactly the same. Now I can see you rolling your eyes. You're sitting there with your smartphone and your 401k thinking, that was Germany 100 years ago. They were losers of a war. They had mustaches and monocles. We are modern. We have sophisticated algorithms. We have the Federal Reserve. Oh, the arrogance. It smells sweeter than the ink on a fresh $100 bill. Do you really think the laws of mathematics care about what year it is? Do you think gravity stops working just because you bought a new pair of shoes and an iPhone? Let's rip the mask off this Scooby-Doo villain right now. What the Weimar government did with clunky steam-powered printing presses, our central banks are doing with a keystroke. They don't even need the paper anymore. They just type a few zeros into a spreadsheet and, poof, trillions of dollars appear out of the ether. They call it quantitative easing because legalized counterfeiting doesn't test well with focus groups. It sounds so scientific, doesn't it? So sterile, like a complex medical procedure. We are just injecting liquidity to stabilize the markets. No, you are injecting heroin into an addict and calling it nutrition. Remember when they told you inflation was transitory? That was the same lie they told the Germans in 1921. It's just supply chain issues, they said. It's just the post-war adjustment. Does that sound familiar? It is the same gaslighting script, just read by actors in better suits. They blame the war in Ukraine. They blame the pandemic. They blame greedy corporations. They will blame the alignment of the stars or the weather on Mars before they admit that doubling the money supply might actually devalue the money. It is the classic magician's trick. Look at this hand over here, while the other hand picks your pocket. Look at the stock market today. Look at the housing market. Prices are at all-time highs, while the real economy is gasping for air. Is your house really worth 40% more than it was 3 years ago? Did you add a gold-plated roof? Did you discover oil in the backyard? No, your house is the same. Your money is just shrinking. We are living in the same catastrophe boom that seduced Berlin in 1922. We are celebrating record stock indices while the average family can't afford eggs. We have swapped the wheelbarrow for the digital wallet, but the destination is the same. The cliff edge is right there, and we are accelerating towards it in a Tesla, convinced that technology will somehow make us fly. So, here's the question that should be keeping you awake at night, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above your bed. If the central bankers are so smart, and they have all the data, why don't they just stop? Why don't they turn off the money printer, raise interest rates to a sane level, and kill inflation before it turns our currency into confetti? The answer is terrifyingly simple. They can't. We have passed the point of no return. We are trapped in a mathematical cage called the sovereign debt trap, and there is no key. Think of the global economy as a junkie. For the last 2 decades, it has been addicted to cheap debt, 0% interest rates, free money, stimulus checks. The entire system is built on the assumption that money will always be free. Governments have borrowed trillions upon trillions of dollars. Corporations are leveraged to the hilt. Zombie companies, businesses that don't actually make a profit, are kept alive solely by cheap loans. Now, imagine walking up to this junkie and saying, "Okay, party's over. We're going cold turkey." What happens? The junkie doesn't just get a headache. The junkie dies. If the central banks truly fight inflation by raising interest rates to match the real rate of inflation, which is what they must do to save the currency, the cost of servicing that mountain of debt explodes. Governments would have to spend their entire tax revenue just to pay the interest on the loans they already took out. They would have to default. The bond market would crash. Pension funds would vaporize. The stock market would collapse by 50% or more. It would be a deflationary depression that makes the 1930s look like a picnic in the park. The politicians know this. The bankers know this. They look at that hard landing scenario, and they are absolutely petrified. So, what is the alternative? The alternative is the Weimar solution. You keep the printing presses running. You manipulate interest rates to keep them artificially low, well below the rate of inflation. This allows the government to pay back its massive debts with devalued currency. It is a soft default. They are robbing you to pay themselves. They are choosing to let inflation run hot because it is the only way they can keep the government solvent without admitting they are bankrupt. They are choosing to sacrifice the currency to save the bond market. This is the exact same corner the Weimar government painted themselves into. They knew that if they stopped printing, the unemployment rate would skyrocket and the reparations payments would fail. They were terrified of a revolution in the streets, so they chose the path of least resistance. Print, print, print. It is a checkmate scenario. If they stop printing, the system collapses immediately from withdrawal. If they keep printing, the system collapses eventually from an overdose. We are currently watching them try to walk a tightrope between these two cliffs, but the wind is picking up and the rope is fraying. They are trapped in a vicious feedback loop where every solution they invent just requires more debt and more printing, which only accelerates the spiral. There is no painless exit. The bill has come due, and the only question left is whether we pay it in a sudden crash or a long, agonizing burn. And so, we arrive at the bitter end. How does the story of the wheelbarrow and the billion-mark bread actually finish? It didn't end with a gentle correction. It ended with a guillotine. On November 15, 1923, the German government finally admitted that the game was over. They introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark. To stop the bleeding, they had to cut off the limb. They set the exchange rate at 1 Rentenmark to 1 trillion old paper marks. Read that again. 1 trillion to 1. In the blink of an eye, 12 zeros were slashed off the price tags. The hallucination ended, and the Germans woke up in a freezing cold reality. The hyperinflation stopped immediately, almost overnight, which economists like to call the miracle of the Rentenmark. But it wasn't a miracle. It was a massacre. The currency stabilization was paid for by the complete and total annihilation of the savings of the German people. If you had money in the bank before 1923, it was gone. Vaporized. You were starting from zero. The debt of the industrialists was wiped clean. The state's debt was erased. But the middle class, the teachers, the doctors, the pensioners, were left holding the bag. They were sacrificed on the altar of stability. But the financial ruin was just the appetizer. The main course was the darkness that followed. You cannot humiliate a proud nation, steal their life savings, starve their children, and destroy their faith in democracy without consequences. The chaos of 1923 broke the psychological spine of Germany. It created a deep, simmering hatred for the system, for the bankers, and for the politicians. It created a desperate hunger for a strong man, a savior who would promise to restore order and punish the traitors. It is no coincidence that a failed artist named Adolf Hitler attempted his first grab for power, the beer hall putsch, in November 1923, right at the peak of the madness. He failed that day, but the anger he tapped into didn't go away. It festered. 10 years later, that same anger swept him into power on a tidal wave of resentment. The hyperinflation of 1923 didn't just destroy the mark. It paved the highway to the concentration camps and the Second World War. This is the warning written in blood on the wall of history. When money dies, society unravels. And now, look at your own world. The players have changed, but the script is the same. We are seeing the same reckless spending, the same debt traps, the same arrogance from central bankers who think they are gods. They will try to keep the plates spinning as long as they can, but eventually, gravity wins. Eventually, the reset comes, and when it does, it won't be friendly. It might be a new digital currency, a CBDC, that gives them total control over your wallet. Or it might be a chaotic collapse that wipes out your 401k. The lesson of Weimar is that you cannot trust the paper in your pocket. It is a promise from a liar. In the end, the only things that mattered were real, tangible assets: gold, land, skills, commodities. The people who held on to paper were destitute. The people who held on to real value survived. The storm is already on the horizon. You can feel the wind changing. The printing presses are humming. The debts are mounting, and the wheelbarrows are being dusted off. History has given you the cheat sheet. The question is, are you arrogant enough to ignore it? Or are you smart enough to get prepared? The choice is yours, but remember, in the game of musical chairs, when the music stops, there are never enough seats.